We're just going back now to some breaking news. Now, there are reports that Boris Johnson is set to resign from his position as the British Prime Minister. This comes after 50 ministers resigned from his cabinet. Many have decided to do so in the last 6 hours or so. A lot of them say that they can no longer serve after Mr Johnson's leadership or under his leadership. A Downing Street source says a new party leader will be installed by the time of the party conference in October. We just got some live pictures just in the base of your screen. That is 10 Downing Street. We believe that there had been some movements around that today where some senior ministers were going inside and outside. We believe that there had been some discussions that they may have been persuading the Prime Minister to be stepping down from this, but we'll bring you more on that information as soon as it comes to hand. Just to bring you up to speed, we've got breaking news coming out of the UK that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is set to resign. We're going to bring in the ABC's Global Affairs editor, John Lyons, who joins me now in the studio. John, there's a lot going on at the moment in the UK.
Lara, what an extraordinary night. We're witnessing one of the great political dramas happening right now in London. We're witnessing one of the most colourful politicians the UK has ever seen, Boris Johnson, who's had a dramatic rise and now a dramatic crash to earth. It's been a death by 1,000 cuts. This was the politician who wouldn't die. This was the great Houdini of politics.
What is it that he has that other Prime Ministers don't have that has allowed him to persevere?
He's not just a politician, but he's a great entertainer. He's an entertainment act. Boris Johnson is, this is vaudeville. He's the best act going around. When he gives a speech, when he talks to school kids, he's incredibly entertaining. He's got an incredible gift of language, the way he phrases things. As it showed when he won the elections to be Mayor of London before he entered federal politics in England, he won over Labor Party seats. He won over working class seats off the Labor Party. So there's something about him that the British public loved, but finally their patience was worn down. And as Sajid Javid said yesterday, the Health Minister, when he resigned in the House of Commons, he said enough is enough. So
it's more than gravitas that he's got?
Yeah, it's in the end, I think what brought him down is his lack of credibility, which Nick Dole and Isabella Higgins have been so well chronicling.
I'll just bring in our Europe correspondent now, Nick Dole. He is there in London, just outside Downing Street. Nick, I imagine there'd be a flurry of journalists and photographers just outside where you are.
Yeah, there's huge interest in this, Lara. Hi there, John. There's a huge media pack waiting to hear from the Prime Minister because we are told that he will be saying something in the coming hours. This news came through a couple of hours ago now.
Nick, you've been there for several hours. Whom have you seen going in and out of Downing Street? You'd assume it would be ministers wanting to persuade the Prime Minister to step aside?
Yes, a lot of the senior ministers did that yesterday, and over the last couple of hours, a lot of ministers have been making their views known on social media, as they tend to do these days. We've seen some staff coming and going too. There's not a great mood, as you might expect, here at number 10. But I guess the Prime Minister knew what he faced.
Let's see if we've got our Europe correspondent Nick Dole back. He was speaking to us previously outside from Downing Street. Nick, interested to get your thoughts about what the electorate has really thought about this in the last 24, 48 hours. I imagine there'd be a few people perhaps changing their minds.
Well, I think that was the real fear, Lara, among MPs, that voters would turn on them. Up until probably even a few months ago, I think most MPs thought that even though people had real misgivings, certainly there were misgivings on the backbench, that the voter support was still there and that Boris Johnson probably could still win an election.
Let's bring in now Dr. Hannah Bunting, a lecturer in government trust and also social data analysis in the UK. Hannah, tell us, what does this recent polling reflect on when it comes to public sentiment around Boris Johnson?
Well, I think it was 2 days ago now, there was a Snap poll that said 70% almost of people thought Boris Johnson was untrustworthy, and more people thought the moon landings were faked than found our Prime Minister trustworthy.
Where do you think that the Conservative Party is going to be in the future? There's obviously going to be some big splits within the side. There's obviously going to be a lot of healing that's required. Where did they go from here?
Yeah, there will now be a leadership contest. So the first round of that contest is decided by Conservative MPs themselves. They will find the final two.
Dr. Bunting, how do you think Keir Starmer is going to use this opportunity for the party? Will he use this as something to seize upon or use it throughout the months to come? How do you think that he'll be navigating this?
It's difficult to predict because of the upcoming leadership contest. So it really depends on who he would be up against and who the next leader of the Conservative Party is, what kind of tactic would work. But certainly Keir Starmer and all of the opposition parties now have some evidence that.
Where do you think the Conservatives will be looking to for future leaders, or who will be replacing Boris Johnson in this?
There are a number of contenders that might have already been throwing their hat into the ring, so to speak, behind closed doors.
Dr. Bunting, what's your take on how Boris Johnson has been perceived internationally? Obviously, Brexit was at the heart of his campaign there and his leadership and his time as Prime Minister. How do you think he has been interpreted from other leaders?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, obviously he's had a lot of international engagements, especially since that's reopened after lockdowns from the pandemic, scandals and crises that have been breaking almost week after week.
A lot to take in for sure. Dr. Hannah Bunting, a lecturer in government trust and social data analyst in the UK. Thank you so much for your time. And John, I know that you'll be sticking around with us next hour as we follow the latest developments out of London. And remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Lara Hyams. Stay with us here on ABC News. More on our top stories after this short break. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Lara Hyams. Just to our breaking news this evening, and Boris Johnson is expected to resign as British Prime Minister after a series of cabinet resignations. A spokesman for Downing Street has confirmed that Mr Johnson will make a statement to the nation tonight. More than 50 government ministers quit and several of his own cabinet members, including newly appointed Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi, who has told the Prime Minister he must go now for the good of the country. It's expected Mr Johnson will remain as Prime Minister until a new leader of the Conservative Party is chosen before the party conference in October. Let's just go live now to the House of Representatives in London, where members are speaking. We were just watching the British Parliament there speaking in the wake of this British crisis. Obviously, Boris Johnson is likely to be resigning imminently in the next few hours. We're expecting him to either release a statement or speak. We're just going to bring in the ABC's Global Affairs editor, John Lyons, now, who joins us in the studio. John, this has been an incredible past few hours and also 24 hours.
Yes, Lara, we're watching perhaps the final act of an incredible British drama.
I'll just bring in Jill Rutter now, who is a former civil servant in the UK Treasury and is currently a senior fellow with the UK's Institute for Government. Jill, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've also got a busy morning ahead. We're obviously expecting a statement around lunchtime, your time, with the Prime Minister's resignation. What's going to happen to the UK leadership then?
a contest for the Conservative Party leadership, and whoever becomes leader of the Conservative Party will become Prime Minister. We don't yet know what the rules for that contest will be, but when Theresa May was replaced in very similar circumstances, that lasted for the best part of a couple of months.
In Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins, she joins us now from London. Isabella, how did we get here?
Well, Lara, this situation is really a surprise to no one who's been following it closely. Boris Johnson has looked like a dead man walking for some time. The last 2 days, the pressure on him has been incredibly intense. But to understand what we're seeing now, we probably need to go back a little bit further to December of 2021 and a man with no integrity by many members of the British public.
That's quite a description there of some people, what they have thought of Boris Johnson. Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins there in London. Thank you so much. John, this has been quite an interesting... You've got lots of adjectives for this kind of thing. How would you describe this past few hours? I mean, this has really been uncharted waters for British politics.
Look, extraordinary drama, better than anything you'll see at the moment on Netflix or Stan or anywhere else.
Or in the thick of it.
The characters, the way the British do this sort of thing. They have a particular way of doing it, like the conversation between Michael Gove and Boris Johnson typifies that, you know. Michael Gove goes, you know...
Now, just returning to our story, our top story of what is happening in British politics at the moment. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, is expected to resign following mass resignations from his party. We've been looking at this issue with Global Affairs editor John Lyon tonight, but joining us right now is politics professor at the Queen Mary University of London, Professor Timothy Bale. Professor, wow, you've had quite a morning.
Yeah, we've all had quite a morning and, in fact, quite an evening. I really can't remember this kind of chaos in terms of the departure of a Prime Minister in my lifetime, and what, I'm 56 years old.
Wow, that's saying something. We've got a large group in the Conservative Party will probably be relieved by this decision by Prime Minister Boris Johnson to be stepping aside. That announcement obviously to come later in the morning. What's your assessment of this?
Well, I think eventually he has bowed to common sense. I think he thought he could stem the flow of departures. It quickly became apparent that he couldn't. And
well, just on that, how would you appeal to the base now? What do they have to go forward? I mean, Brexit is done now. There's obviously international issues at hand that requires Britain's attention, such as the war in Ukraine at the moment. What do they have to appeal to those voters? Well,
Conservative Party membership out in the country is fairly unrepresentative, both demographically and ideologically. What will appeal to them, to some extent, will be a continued prosecution of this so-called culture war on woke. So, you know, against all things politically correct, although that doesn't really interest the rest of the country very much, it has to be said.
Professor Timothy Bale, politics professor at the Queen Mary University of London. Thank you so much. You'll need a cup of tea after that. And I'll just let viewers know that we will be continuing our coverage of Boris Johnson's impending resignation, which means the business won't run at its usual time at 8:45 Eastern. But you can watch the program on ABC iView or on ABC TV at 10:15, wherever you are in the country. John, this has been an extraordinary few hours. Obviously now, before the resignation has even happened of Boris Johnson, we're beginning to talk about who the next leader is going to be, and it's not just us having that conversation.
That's right, Lara. YouGov has just commissioned a snap poll in the UK, looking at who would be the most likely or the preferred people to take over from Boris Johnson.
Well, following the news of Boris Johnson's impending resignation, members of the British House of Commons have been left to speculate on what comes next. Here's a look at some of their reactions.
Had it not been for the fact that each and every one of them on those benches upheld and let this Prime Minister carry on, he should have resigned. He should have resigned when Partygate happened. He should have resigned when Durhamgate happened.
Exactly.
He should have resigned when his ethics advisor resigned.
We're just going to go to London now, where Keir Starmer, leader of the Labor Party, is speaking.
He'll get a general election if he just switches leaders.
He needs to go. He can't cling on in this way. His own party have finally concluded that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't now inflict him on the country for the next few months. It's obvious he's unfit to be Prime Minister. That's been blindingly obvious for a very, very long time.
That was Keir Starmer there, who's the leader of the Labor Party, obviously responding to this crisis that is gripping UK politics. John Lyon, this has been a very interesting night, to say the least. Obviously, we've got Boris Johnson, who is expected to be stepping down, we think, but still a lot of moving parts in this story.
That's right. We're waiting for an announcement out of London for a press conference from Boris Johnson, who is now widely reported by credible sources to be preparing to announce his resignation.
Well, those cost of living pressures don't make it any easier. Just on that, we did speak to Bruce Wilson from the European Centre of Excellence a little earlier on, and he was mentioning about the number of contenders that could vie for the top job in the event of a power vacuum.
There are some who've been quite public about their their personal ambition. Liz Truss, the current Foreign Secretary, Rishi Sunak, who has been Chancellor and has just resigned 2 days ago. Perhaps the most interesting of all is Jeremy Hunt, who was one of the opponents to Johnson when Johnson won the leadership in 2019.
We've also had some international reaction to this news today. First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has said on Twitter that there will be widespread sense of relief that the chaos of the last few days will come to an end. The notion of Boris Johnson staying on as PM until autumn seems far from ideal and surely not sustainable. That's a pretty strong response there, John, isn't it?
Yes, Lara, and it shows you how much Boris Johnson is trying to hang in there.
Thank you. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
Well, that was British Prime Minister Boris Johnson there. He has resigned. He did give a statement to the nation. He was saying that he was stepping down as the Conservative leader, but he would still remain as Prime Minister, but more in a caretaker capacity. That would be until a new leader can be elected. We know that Labor leader Keir Starmer says he will call it if Mr Johnson does stay on in that caretaker role. And this also follows the resignation of almost 60 ministers since yesterday, and also public calls from senior members of the government for Boris Johnson to step down. He was a strong advocate for Brexit. He did lead the Conservative Party to a landslide victory in 2019. We are joined by Global Affairs editor John Lyons here. John, what did you make of that statement? I guess before we go through the analysis, one of the things is the timeline for this. We still don't exactly know how this transition of power is going to look like.
Lara, I thought it was well crafted, quite a gracious speech. It was quite personal. He talked about how sad he was to be giving up the best job in the world, how painful it had been. He talked about how he tried in the last few days to convince his colleagues that, you know, we're not that far behind in the polls. So in the end, it got down to numbers, that we had a massive win at the last election and we can do it again. And he talked about, that this is the beginning of a process.
Yeah, there was quite a bit in there. Let's just go to Oh, we won't go to Nick Dole at the moment. We will bring in Nick Rowley, I should say. We were speaking to Nick a little earlier on, and he's been monitoring this situation as it has been unfolding. He is the former Downing Street advisor and also senior lecturer at the London School of Economics. Nick, thank you so much for coming back. I know that you must have had a very interesting morning. I have to say, though, you would think that Boris Johnson used some of that speech, a lot of it, to really sound like a resume, his resume and achievements, saying how his party had led the country through the pandemic. Also, was able to lead the vaccine rollout out of Europe and was also leading the West in the response to Ukraine. Quite some achievements there, as he would say.
He would. I mean, these are very, very difficult times for anyone having to stand up in front of the world's media outside a place that has become your own home. He's done a fair bit of home renovation to the flat at Downing Street. He'll be leaving that soon.
John, we've been speaking about the cost of living pressures that the UK is facing at the moment. It's seemingly only going to get worse, and now with no one at the helm of this ship, it's going to be really difficult to navigate.
Yes, Lara, whoever does take over from this messy departure of Boris Johnson has a hell of a task in front of them.
This has been a really extraordinary evening. We just want to thank our guest, former Downing Street advisor and senior lecturer at the London School of Economics, Nick Rowley. Professor Nick Rowley, thank you so much for your time, and also the ABC's Global Affairs editor, John Lyons. It's been a huge marathon this evening. I thank you so much for your involvement too.